Welcome back. In our last session, we looked at diagnosis of two species of operator-controllable errors: inadvertent errors and errors due to lack of technique. In this session, we will look at willful errors. First, the distinguishing features. Willful errors are witting. At the time of making the error, the worker is aware of it. They are intentional. The worker is deliberately causing the error. And they are persistent. The worker intends to keep on making errors. On the face of it, it's reprehensible for workers to make errors deliberately. But some such errors are management-initiated. A common reason is multiple standards. Managers have standards for cost, delivery, productivity, as well as quality. Managers would like to meet all standards, but the marketplace keeps changing its priorities, making it difficult to meet all standards simultaneously. The resulting pressures force the managers to resort to trade-offs and to revise priorities so as to respond to the marketplace. In turn, these revisions are then transmitted to the workers, who feel forced to engage in willful violation of some standards in order to meet other standards. In other cases, a misguided management program results in willful worker errors, as in the case of the misguided drive on the cost of poor quality. A consultant visits a company and asks about the costs of poor quality. The figures look suspiciously low for this industry. The accountant defends the figures and explains the procedures. It looks like the accountant is not getting all the information from the basic sources, the scrap tickets, the repair tickets. So the consultant goes out to the shop and talks to the workforce. Now all emerges. See that area over there? Wait until the snow melts in the spring. So the scrap is there, or it's in the river, or it gets smuggled out. It all began with a management drive on the high cost of poor quality. During that drive, some managers misused the information on the scrap and rework tickets to blame the workers. Some of the blame was not warranted. There were enough such cases to cause many workers to stop writing out tickets, to hide the scrap and the rework. Why should we make out these documents when management then uses them as a club to punish us? So now the company is losing money without knowing why. For example, the record for some costly component X shows the following. We know 100 were made. Our records show we paid for them. We know 75 of them were assembled into finished product and shipped. The product can't work without component X. We know there are 15 of them in stock. We just counted them. So 10 are missing. What happened to them? We don't know. At year's end, the accountant writes off the loss. We know we lost the money, but we don't know why, since there are no scrap tickets to tell us. To find the causes, we must abolish the atmosphere of blame. Now, those workers were clearly violating the company rules. The rules say make out the scrap and repair tickets. So we are dealing with willful errors. But in this case, the managers must bear much of the responsibility for the willful violation. In contrast, many willful errors are operator-initiated. Some are traceable to real or fancied grievances against the boss or the company. Some are just antisocial conduct. The extreme cases are vicious, sabotage, conspiracy. No one defends these extremes. In other cases, the responsibility is confused by poor communication. Let's look at 3 cases. First, the repeat release of non-conforming product. In the last 3 months, 3 batches of product failed to meet the specification for quality characteristic X. In each case, the sequence was like this. The batch as made by the worker did not conform to specification. The inspector discovered the nonconformance to specification and placed a hold on the batch. That was reviewed by the Material Review Board and released for shipment to the client. No information was given to the worker or to the inspector as to the reason for release. Now it's time to make a new batch. The worker is setting up the process. The worker recalls that those prior batches were shipped despite the nonconformance to specification. So the worker runs the process knowing that this batch will also be nonconforming to specification. The new batch then goes to the inspector, who discovers the nonconformance to specification. The inspector recalls the previous history of prior cases, but the inspector goes further than the worker. The inspector concludes it would be best not to report the nonconformance at all. They all get shipped anyway. It would save work for everyone if I just keep quiet. We may be heading for disaster. Neither the worker nor the inspector realizes that in those former cases, there were special reasons justifying the shipment. For this batch, there are no such reasons. The worker and the inspector are making willful errors, but the managers have contributed to the errors by failure to communicate information which would influence employee actions. Second, the case of the selective scoreboards. During a drive to improve deliveries to clients, a company puts up scoreboards in all departments to show performance against schedules. But there are no scoreboards on quality. The workforce can logically conclude that management is more interested in quantity than in quality. Third case, the campaign for better quality. The managers launch a poster campaign urging all workers to do better work. The bulk of the defects are management controllable, but the campaign makes no provision to improve process capability, machine maintenance, quality of purchased components, and so on. It should surprise no one if the workers conclude this is a case of do as we say, not do as we do. So we see that finding the causes of willful errors is not so simple. It's not a case of the good guys versus the bad guys. Most willful errors are committed in complex situations involving multiple conflicting standards, foggy communications, shared responsibilities. These complexities also complicate the journey from symptom to cause, especially for antisocial willful errors. In our diagnostic journey, we start with a symptom, willful errors. We want to find the cause so we can apply a remedy. Once again, we find ourselves deep in the behavioral sciences. And again, we are being led into an endless swamp. Should we find our way through the swamp or go around? We will try both. Right now, we will go direct from symptom to remedy. We do have some remedies for willful errors, even if we don't know the cause. In a later session on motivation, we will get back to causes. One remedy is to depersonalize the order. Let's look at two cases. First, the textile mill spinners. Some of the women in the spinning room were tying incorrect knots when joining two ends of yarn. It was serious. It made much trouble for the weavers and the looms. The spinning room supervisor pleaded and threatened without success. Then the personnel manager was sent down. He hunted up the unofficial leader of those rebels. What's going on? Why don't you tie the right knots? By this time, the situation was getting abrasive. And she flared up, what difference does it make? He walked her over to the weaving department to show her. And she burst into tears. Why didn't somebody tell us? It solved the problem. They didn't like the boss. They didn't like the company. Their grievances were not being met. But they were not willing to make trouble for the weavers. their awareness of the need was a stronger motivator than the orders of the company. The second case relates to the sewing machine company's management development program. It included asking shop foremen to acquire product knowledge by working in other departments. So the foremen of the departments making components spent time assembling and testing sewing machines. Some of these foremen made the central shafts, those precise multi-cam components which actuate the sewing machine mechanisms. These foremen learned that some problems in assembly and test were traceable to the shafts. They took action on this information. Previously, they were unwilling to act just on complaints from the assembly and test supervisors who had cried wolf too often. As with the spinners, direct awareness of the need was a stronger motivator than the personalized complaints from the assembly and test supervisors. The common principle in these cases is depersonalizing the order. The management philosopher Mary Parker Follett named the principle the law of the situation. Her principle was, one person should not give orders to another person. Both should take their orders from the situation. We can show this law by a diagram as applied to that textile mill. The situation is that the weavers and looms require special knots. This situation is binding on the president, on the managers, on the supervisors, and on the spinners. A second remedy for willful errors is to establish means for accountability or traceability. In all operator-controllable errors, a prime need is to know who is the worker. To illustrate, in one company, the final product was packaged in bulky bales. Those were transported by forklift trucks. Periodically, a prong of the fork pierced a bale and did a lot of damage. But no one knew which trucker moved which bale. When the company found a way to identify which trucker moved which bale, the result was a sharp drop in the incidence of punctured bales. Similarly, companies use systems to assure accountability for valuable material. Workers sign for material received and are credited for material returned. All persons behave more responsibly when their identity is known. It is the anonymous persons who write the hate mail and phone in the bomb threats. A third approach is to provide balanced emphasis. All workers are asked to meet multiple standards: quality, delivery, productivity. Often it's difficult to meet all standards simultaneously. Hence, some standards receive higher priority than others. The worker's priority is strongly influenced by the outward evidences of what are the priorities of the boss, the company. A conspicuous form of evidence is the system of scoreboards. If the department has scoreboards on productivity and delivery, but not quality, then the worker draws conclusions. Similarly, if the department keeps score on individual workers for productivity, but not for quality, again the worker draws conclusions. A further approach to remedy for willful errors is the periodic audit. An audit is an independent review of performance. It's done on a sampling basis. That avoids the cost of continuing scoreboards or continuing traceability. The fact of exposure to possible audit is itself a form of deterrent. The most constructive approach is to provide assistance to workers. There was an example in the piston ring foundry. First, the managers reduced management controllable defects drastically. Then the managers launched a program to reduce operator controllable defects. That program included a form of assistance to workers. The company made use of quality cue cards. The cue card was a wall poster. It listed several principal operator-controllable defects for a specific process. For each such defect, it listed also a narrative description of the knack available to avoid making that defect. Cue cards were prepared for each principal process. In addition, posters were prepared to explain the knack by use of diagrams. For example, in the sand casting department. Here at the upper left, we see good vertical alignment or stacking of the molds prior to pouring. In the upper right, we see a misalignment. The associated legend reads, "Here's a misrun due to poor stacking." Miniature pocket-sized cue cards were supplied to each worker in the respective processing departments. Much work was needed to prepare these cue cards. It took time to identify the vital few operator-controllable defects, to identify the knack needed to avoid making the defects, to prepare the narratives and diagrams in lucid, colorful form. Identification of the knack provided two useful byproducts, a basis for training new workers and as input to a checklist for process audits. Number 6, yet another aid to reducing willful errors is to improve communications. Usually, companies do a good job of communicating information on quality specifications, procedures, standards, and methods. All of this is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Companies should also provide means for workers to communicate their views and ideas. In addition, the companies should explain those actions of management which seem outwardly antagonistic to quality. For example, when non-conforming lots of product are sent out as fit for use, there is seldom any communication to the workforce as to the reason why. The hold document for such lots lists various questions to be answered before release. This list seldom includes the question, what shall we communicate to the workforce? Lacking such a question on the list, the matter is not even considered, and hence there's no communication to the workers by default. Number 7, communication via QC circles. The QC circle is a team of workers trained in problem solving and given company time to work on projects related to their jobs. Companies which use QC circles have an added opportunity for good communication. The managers and the QC circles must reach agreement on which projects to tackle. The circle needs some aids from outside their department. Data, tools to try out new ideas, instruments and tests to see if the results are good. Still more communication takes place to discuss whether the managers will adopt the recommendations of the circle. All this has a good impact on promoting job interest and in improving the climate. All acquire a better understanding of why the others behave as they do. Number 8, create competition or incentives. These devices have potential value, but they can also be misused. Workers resent being pitted against each other in destructive competition, but they do not resent friendly rivalry, such as prevails among interdepartmental sport contests or bridge leagues. Financial incentives are deceptively attractive. When pay is going up, such incentives are bonuses for good work. But when pay is going down, the incentives become penalty systems with all the arguments about who is responsible. Well-designed non-financial incentives can secure comparable results without most of the arguments. Number 9, foolproof the operation. The foolproofing concept is applicable to all species of operator-controllable error. We will look at this in a later session. Number 10, reassign the work. This option is often available to managers. It takes several forms. Assign the most critical work to workers with the best quality record. Redesign the job. Separate the critical tasks from the non-critical. Then make selective work assignments. For defect-prone workers, go direct from symptom to remedy. Find the less demanding job. For example, that insurance policy writer who made nearly half the errors. Motivation. This is the 11th form of remedy for willful errors. We will look at it in a later session when we discuss motivation for all, managers as well as workers. That was a long list of remedies for willful errors, largely applicable even if we don't fully know the causes. But a choice from that list of remedies still requires a study of the symptoms and the surrounding circumstances. To illustrate, the willful failure to make out scrap tickets originated in an atmosphere of blame. The inspector's failure to report a non-conforming lot was influenced by lack of information on why similar prior lots had been shipped. The worker's conclusion that managers want quantity, not quality, was drawn from a presence of a scoreboard on deliveries and the absence of any such scoreboard on quality. The spinner's failure to tie the correct knots was done without awareness of the consequences of wrong knots. The punctured bales were associated with lack of information on identity of which trucker had moved which bale. These cases make clear that we take risks if we apply remedies blindly without understanding the symptoms and related circumstances. We do avoid the work of analysis, but we end up prescribing a cure for the wrong disease. The next step in the breakthrough sequence is properly the remedial journey. Before we take that journey, it is useful to have a closer look at the diagnostic tools. That is what we will do in our next session. Now let's review the high points of this session. Willful worker errors originate with management as well as with workers. Management-initiated worker errors are due mainly to multiple and changing goals and incomplete communications to workers. Efforts to find basic causes of willful worker-initiated errors usually end up in the swamp of the behavioral sciences. Many remedies for willful errors can be applied even when we don't fully know the causes. Depersonalize the order. Establish accountability. Provide balanced emphasis. Conduct quality audits. Provide assistance to workers. Improve communications. Create competition and incentives. Foolproof the operation. Reassign the work. Use the tools of motivation. Choice among these remedies still requires a clear understanding of the symptoms. Finally, between now and the next session, look back at prior company approaches to willful worker errors. In the light of this session, what are your conclusions as to the adequacy of those prior approaches? With respect to your team project, determine the extent of willful errors. With whom did these errors originate? And what remedies should be applied? Also, read the workbook notes for session 11. Good luck.